We recently got a really interesting article from Jake Fischer talking about the blueprint for the Sixers offseason, and he brought some new names into this mix. In the video, I want to bring up Zach LaVine, talk about his potential fit on the Sixers, and dive into why this star hunting plan may have more credence to it than I've initially given credit. That I personally have leaned into the side of things that maybe it does make sense to lean on some of these higher impact role players to fill out the roster around Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. But he makes a compelling case and very clear that Daryl Morey is committed to this opportunity. So I do want to hear him out as it pertains to the championship window and look at Zach LaVine specifically as well as some of the other options that he mentioned. So I want to dive into this star hunting theory and why that both Jake Fischer and Daryl Morey seem to believe that this is so important. And he writes in this here that he first sets up the article, framing it, talking about the Pacers' all-in push on Pascal Siakam, how effective that has been for raising their ceiling as a team, which you cannot deny to this point. And then it leads into that is the same path that the Philadelphia 76ers plan to pursue this summer, according to league sources. That has been the strategy of lead executive Daryl Morey dating back to his days piloting the Houston Rockets, and it was the same guiding principle Sam Hinkie, at first a Morey lieutenant with the Rockets, utilized when spearheading the Sixers process that produced Joel Embiid. Decades of data, so the thinking goes, is unequivocal. The history of the NBA champions is littered with teams that rostered at least three all-star caliber players. The odds of winning a championship are not typically swung by role players or veteran minimum signings, but the game's greatest. And this was something that I kind of brushed over. Obviously, we know that the best players, the best teams are who win the championship. But I think I'm a little bit cut from the mindset that it's incredibly important to have players that complement each other, guys that bring out the best in each other, guys that make each other's games better when sharing the floor together. But they make an interesting case about the all-star outlook here, and he continues on to say, since 2012-2013, the chance a team reaches the conference finals nearly doubles, 18.5% to 30.8%, when a roster boasts 3 top players compared to 2 top players, according to team building reviewed by Yahoo Sports, with top players being those who made an all-star or all-NBA team within 2 years of the current season and played 29-plus minutes per game. The championship odds for teams with 2 top players stand at just 0.9% compared to 14% with teams featuring 3. Every title winner since 2013 has rostered at least a trio of alphas aside from 2 teams, last June's Nuggets and the Lakers being the other option there. Now, very compelling here. Obviously, we know that talent is the biggest thing, and that's clearly what this is leading into. And Daryl Morey has made it crystal clear by all of his actions throughout the entirety of his NBA tenure that he is a guy that wants to fish for the big fish, that he does not want to shop around the margins, maximize on these minimum deals. And while that's still important with guys like Kelly Oubre who make more of an impact than their contract would indicate, that the bottom line is it is these superstars that get the job done. And he does bring up some of the options that in this article that Jake kind of goes through all the different options, the ones that we do know, that Paul George, he's currently in control of his own destiny, that he has to accept the Sixers offer. He can stay in LA if he wants to. LeBron James has to opt out of his contract. OG Anunoby seems to be the inside track on returning to the New York Knicks, although Jake was more open to him potentially being available than I expected to be the case, but there were a couple new names that entered. And this section of the article kind of leans on the option of what if none of the top guys are there? What if none of those names want to or are available to come to Philly? And he writes, the Sixers, sources said, took note of Indiana's 2-year splurge for Bruce Brown that then became the biggest salary headed back to Toronto in exchange for Siakam. Veteran wings like Klay Thompson and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope would fall on the Sixers list of targets for similar 1+1 contracts, sources said. So to start with that there, this meaning that the Bruce Brown contract, I believe he's making $25 million a year, which is a ton for Bruce Brown, only a 2-year deal with an option for the second year. The Raptors are currently trying to, flip him for something else, but that was the driving force for making this deal possible to get Pascal Siakam, because we know the NBA standards, how important the contract matters when flipping a contract to make that number work. So the Sixers have clearly noticed that it was effective for the Pacers, that Bruce Brown was a win-now piece they brought in to help set the tone for the team and then help them by flipping it for a better player that would not have been possible if they did not have that level of salary to use. I think that's a bit of a hole that the Sixers could put themselves in if they do go all in on these superstars here, when you have so much of your salary cap committed to 3 specific players and the rest of the roster being made up of minimum or very low contract, mid-level exception type players. You're very just handcuffed in the options that you have on the trade market purely when it comes to the money standards. But the second part of this, I think, is particularly interesting here, that he writes, Striking out on a big-time wing would also leave the door open for Philadelphia to consider taking back a player such as Zach LaVine, sources said, in the event that Chicago or another team is willing to attach draft capital to move off salary. Kyle Kuzma will be another advanced wing player on the trade market, although Washington's asking price for the veteran scorer prior to February's trade deadline was too rich for most rival teams. So Zach LaVine is where I want to dig in a little bit here. That the concept that it would take, draft capital to be attached for a deal to be done is really intriguing to me. If you're talking about bringing in Zach LaVine and draft capital to get a deal done, sign me up for that. And for the Zach LaVine discussions as a whole, Zach LaVine is not perfect. Zach LaVine is not the crystal clear what I want in a basketball player at all times. I think defensively, he does not always compete. He does not hang. But I think the version of Zach LaVine that we've seen most recently is not the best version of Zach LaVine. And frankly, I would be ready to wager right now that he will be a guy that in another point in his career is playing far more conducive to winning basketball than is the case in Chicago. Now, the Zach LaVine story, it's clear that he does not want to be in Chicago anymore. And in his defense, nor would I if I was in his shoes, that the Bulls are one of the worst-run franchises in sports. They have not made a trade for a player since 2021. They seem dead set on wanting to run it back again this year, bring back DeMar DeRozan, and just stay in the basketball purgatory that they find themselves in. I think LaVine's a guy that wants to compete and wants to win. And frankly, there's not that much of a chance in Chicago. You can point to different things here. I think the Lonzo Ball injury was pretty critical and really closed the window on that team. I do think they were heading in the right direction prior to that, and that's just a tough one there. But the bottom line is Zach LaVine wants out. He wants a fresh start, and it seems to be in the best interest of the Bulls to give him that. So much so that LaVine himself shut himself down for 4 to 6 months due to getting surgery on his right foot this season. That was in the middle of the season, right before the trade deadline, and something which LaVine, it was an optional surgery. This was not something that he could have played through if he absolutely wanted to. Ultimately, he took the long-term best interest for himself, and I can't fully hate him for that, and especially if that is a vehicle to drive him to Philadelphia. So to get into a little bit of who he is as a player, I think he's far better than he gets credit for. That the pendulum swings on these guys so far in each direction. And for LaVine, he's now labeled as this losing player, this guy that can't play on winning teams, on and on and on. And in reality, I just think he needs a fresh start. So to dive into the stats here, that through his career, he's averaged 20.5 points per game, 4.1 rebounds, 3.9 assists, shot 38.2% from beyond the three-point arc on 5.8 attempts per game. At his best season, he shot 41.9% on 8.2 three-pointers. That was when he still in Chicago just a couple years ago, the 2020-2021 season. He has made 2 All-Star games, been in the mix for most improved. He's won a dunk contest. We all know these things. And for LaVine specifically, a lot of the criticism comes with the contract. And to get into that specifically, what he is making is he is on the books for $43 million this year, $45.9 million next year, and then a player option for $48.9 million in the 26-27 season. While that is plenty of money, while that is certainly an investment that you're making to a guy, I can live with that for a guy like Zach LaVine. And when we talk about skill set, he is a guy that I think is that bridge in between Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. They still obviously will have holes to address. They have a whole roster to build out beyond just this one major deal here that you're going to need a true wing defender, a guy that can guard the Jason Tatums of the world, guard the Giannis's of the world, these top-end Eastern Conference talents that these Sixers are going to have to go to throughout the playoff route. But the bottom line is, from a scoring production, from a catch-and-shoot opportunity, that Zach LaVine's incredibly efficient off the catch-and-shoot opportunities, that he will make a living getting shots off the Joel Embiid double in a way that has never been the case before in his career. And he also is a guy that can function both on and off ball, that he will be complementary to Tyrese Maxey in the standpoint that he's not going to step on his toes, he's not going to bump him out of the pecking order, but he can get his when the team needs it. So when you're talking about the stock price being at an all-time low for something, that's how I feel about Zach LaVine, that he's still 29 years old. And when having these conversations about what guys are, being labeled as losing players, all these types of things, I would just like to point out that you're a loser until you're not. That each of these guys goes through their individual career arcs in which they change the narrative on themselves. Karl Anthony Towns is a perfect example of this for now. This guy was the #1 overall pick, was constantly looked at as a guy that was a disappointment, not capable of being a franchise cornerstone. And is the reality that he can't be the best player on a championship team? Yes. But does that mean that he sucks or you can't win with him? Absolutely not. And we're seeing that as the second or third or debatably even fourth, if you really want to have a ton of love for Jaden McDaniels or Naz Reid here. But Karl Anthony Towns has been really good in these playoffs, and he's found his niche as being a guy who takes a bit of a backseat to an Anthony Edwards type. if Zach LaVine is thrown in a spot where there's not as high of expectations or he's not asked to carry a team in the way that he previously has been asked to do, I think he could be in a lane that could be far better for both sides of things, for the Sixers and for Zach LaVine himself. And by the way, there are the connections right here in Philadelphia, that he is a Drew Hanlon guy having the same trainer as Joel Embiid. He's also a guy that is a Clutch Sports guy, as is Tyrese Maxey. He's also a New Balance guy, as is Tyrese Maxey. I know they're in a commercial together, that they filmed together. There's at least some sort of relationship there. And by the way, Tyrese will train under Drew Hanlon as well. So maybe we just roll with the Drew Hanlon direction, and that's how we round out this team. But the bottom line is, I do think the Sixers should be interested in this. I understand that you can't close other doors until you can see what is going on with Paul George, what is going on with OG Anunoby. But don't be surprised if Zach LaVine is a name that finds himself in Philadelphia. And frankly, this is a name that I think should be receiving more buzz than has been the case so far. I get the concerns. I understand the defensive issues, but he's still young. He's 29 years old. He can rewrite a narrative for himself. And I do think he fits this team mostly for what you're looking for. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Would you be in on the Zach LaVine experience? Are you willing to give him a chance in Philadelphia in the same way I am? Let me know if you agree or disagree. Drop a like on this video and make sure you are subscribing to Sixers Digest. It does feel like the offseason flames are beginning to heat up, and I cannot wait until Penn starts to hit paper with some of these deals, and we're getting a concept of what the league will look like next year. So stay with me from start to finish and make sure we're staying along. Once again, smash that subscribe button to make sure you're hanging, and I'll be talking with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.